Welcome to the global webinar of the 4-country research project on translating of modeled evidence for decision-making. My name is Apurva Handigul, and I'm a program associate at Results for Development, a nonprofit international development organization headquartered in Washington, D.C. Between October 2021 and June 2022, a consortium of partners conducted a 4-country study to better understand how to bridge the gap between producing modeled evidence and its use for policy and decision-making. This research study was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and coordinated by Results for Development, Access Health International in India, the Health Policy Research Group in Nigeria, an independent consultant in Kenya, and Nuna Health Research Center in Burkina Faso, aimed at understanding how modeled evidence is being used in public health decision-making, both in health policy and health program implementation. We're delighted to have you all here at today's webinar. Let's go to our agenda slide, please. So what we'll be going over today is an introduction to the research study, overview of study objectives and methodology, and a presentation of global findings. We'll also be moving into a panel discussion on our key findings and recommendations, followed by Q&A. So please feel free to enter your questions for our speakers and panelists throughout the webinar using the Q&A feature down below. With that note, I'd like to introduce you to Ms. Emily Dansereau to give a brief overview of the research study. Emily is a senior program officer on the immunization team at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He supports grantees to develop and apply analytics and modeling that help extend the benefits of immunization to all children, adolescents, adults, and communities. Over to you, Emily.
Thanks so much, Apurva, and welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Great to see everybody here. I'll keep this brief, but it's really exciting to be at this point in the project and get to hear all the results from the research that's been going on. So this study was born out of the experience that I think a lot of us have had who work in the areas of modeling or in programs or policy, of knowing that there's so much rich and rigorous modeling and analytics work that takes place, but it's not always translated into the policy and program actions that it should be. And on the other hand, there are so many decision makers that are facing really difficult and challenging and uncertain trade-offs and choices that could benefit from modeling and analytics, but they're not always able to access and tap into those kinds of resources. So we wanted to fund this work to help understand how can we bridge that gap better? How can we support our grantees both on the analytics and modeling side and also on the program policy side to be able to bridge that gap between those? So really, yeah, pleased and proud to have supported the work that these wonderful teams will present to you today. Both the work for the Translating Modeled Evidence for Decision-Making project and also some work that will be presented by a team from KEMRI that was focused specifically on how this has played out in the context of COVID, which we all know has heightened a lot of these challenges, but also brought a lot of opportunities and interest in modeling. So I think with that, we can hand back over to the teams to share this work. And thanks again, everyone, for all the work that's gone into this project and for being here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. Next, I would like to invite my colleague, Ms. Leah Ewald, Senior Program Officer at Results for Development, to provide an overview of our research objectives and methodology. Leah coordinates the Translating Modeled Evidence for Decision-Making project at R4D. She brings experience in collaborative learning and health system strengthening from her work supporting R4D projects such as the Learning Network for Countries in Transition from Gavi Support for Immunization and USAID's Health System Strengthening Accelerator. Over to you, Leah.
Thanks, Apurva. So I'm going to very briefly touch on the background and context for this work, as well as our methodology before we get into the discussion of our results and recommendations. So next slide. So quick definitions of terms to start us off. When we're talking about modeled evidence, we're talking about mathematical models that simulate different potential health scenarios, including scenarios around disease transition and or the impact of policy interventions on health outcomes, for example. We know from the literature that modeled evidence can be a valuable tool for helping decision makers choose between complex trade-offs, and that the inability to ensure decisions are informed by the best modeling possible results in losses of efficiency, effectiveness, and impact. We also know from the literature, however, that decision makers do not always use modeled evidence for reasons most commonly cited, including a lack of policy relevant models, a perception that models are too complex to understand or are based on too many assumptions, or a lack of communication between decision makers and modelers. Next slide. So the objectives of our research are threefold. The first is to identify the factors and approaches that facilitate or constrain exchanges between decision makers and modelers. The second is to assess current practices and partnerships in contexts or forums which the translation of modeled evidence into decision making is occurring. And the third is to offer recommendations to inform changes on funding approaches, organizational structures, or country and global policies to enable success in translating modeled evidence into decision making. Next slide. So a few more terms that we're going to be throwing out a lot. By modeling organizations, we're talking about organizations that produce modeled evidence. So these are commonly researchers or people in academic institutions. Skipping to the bottom, by decision makers, we're referring to the end users or potential users of modeled evidence, and those who participate in making decisions for national or subnational health policies and strategies. These people are most commonly found in government organizations. And then between them, we have the individuals who participate in helping to translate the modeled evidence for the decision makers' use. And so we're dividing these into two groups, and we're pulling these categories from research into other fields of evidence use for decision making, particularly climate change. So in one group, we have the boundary organizations, and these are standalone organizations that translate evidence, distill findings, foster dialogue for policy and practice. So these are independent organizations. And then we also have knowledge brokers. So these are individuals that may sit within modeler or decision-making organizations to help with this translation. So they are not independent. We also recognize that organizations can play more than one role. Some are both decision makers and modelers, some are both modelers and knowledge brokers, et cetera. Next slide. So as Apurva mentioned, this work was carried out by our 4 research partners in our research countries. It was coordinated by Results for Development based in Washington, D.C. and funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Next slide. And this research was conducted between about September 2021 and June 2022, with the dates varying slightly by country. Next slide. We applied a mixed methods approach, including a desk review in each country, a survey, and in-depth key informant interviews with over 200 decision makers, modelers, and brokers of modeled evidence across our 4 research countries. The work in Kenya had a slightly smaller scope. It was tacked on at the end to add 1 more country's worth of experience. So they did fewer key informant interviews and no survey. Next slide. We also, a final note is that we had a working group, and this working group represented stakeholders in the 4 research countries. Members were selected by country research teams, and they all had important roles in the modeling to decision-making ecosystem in their country as modelers, researchers, or knowledge brokers, or boundary organizations. And their goal was to root the research in country context and priorities, provide a platform for country actors to learn from the experiences of other members, and share feedback with donors and other global partners about good practices for enhancing access and use of high-quality modeled evidence. So their inputs are incorporated throughout our findings and recommendations that we've put in this presentation. Next slide. And with that, I will hand it back over to Apurva. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. Now I'd like to invite Mr. Maulik Chokshi, Deputy Country Director of Access Health International, to share the key findings and recommendations of this study. Maulik drives Access Health's health systems work in India and provides technical and programmatic leadership for its policy work. He brings with him 2 decades worth of health experience. He spent 8 highly regarded years with the Public Health Foundation of India, worked as an advisor to the global healthcare information company IMS Health, and as a consultant to many national and international agencies and development partners. Malik has worked extensively on policies and capacity building initiatives related to medicine procurement, pricing, immunization, maternal and child health, and healthcare financing in an Indian setting. Over to you, Malik.
Thank you very much, Apurva. And it's a privilege to be here and an honor to present on behalf of the partners who did research on the use of modeled evidence in decision making. So I take an opportunity to present this as close as possible. Can I go to the next slide, please? So can we go to the next slide, please? So when we talk about the ecosystem of modeled evidence use in decision making, as we outlined, there are four main actors: donors, funders, and they are primarily organization funding space, which is primarily funded by international development partner or government funding. Then modelers. Who do we mean by modelers? In most of the countries, they are university or private research institute with large variety of parastatal research organizations, local and international NGOs, government agencies, and regional initiatives that construct the modeling ecosystem, and it is expanding. When we talk about knowledge brokers, they are modelers who are engaged in direct knowledge brokering with government, and they are allowed to work independent of organization, and this function varies across the countries. So in most developed countries, the modeling to decision-making ecosystem has highest degree of overlaps between the modeling expertise as well as in knowledge broking. And with most modeling organizations playing both the roles, and especially in the countries like India and Kenya, where the modeling organization as well as the boundary organization, the role was played by the same organizations. And when we start talking about knowledge exchange, how was the knowledge experience of the evidence generated through model being shared? Primarily, it was done through government-led advisory groups or working groups and task force. And COVID has got a lot of kind of similar task forces which used modeled evidence in decision making. And primarily because prior to that, there was no evidence available. So the best possible opportunity was use modeled evidence in decision making. There are also independent research coalitions that provide important platforms for debate and knowledge dissemination, particularly in countries which are large and complex data ecosystems like India, where we have got huge 29 states and union territories. There, this kind of mechanism was quite often used for knowledge exchange. Next slide, please. When we started looking at where is this evidence used in the four countries that listed, Burkina Faso, India, Kenya, and Nigeria, tuberculosis and COVID were disease-specific areas where maximum amount of modeled evidence was used. Malaria also falls into the same bracket where a lot of modeled evidence was used. HIV was used in Burkina Faso, India, and Nigeria. And if you look at Kenya, there were a use of model evidence in decision making in disease-specific area of rabies, influenza, and NTDs. And this shows the diversity of use of modeled evidence in decision making. Next slide, please. We wanted to understand what facilitates or inhibits the exchange of modeled evidence. And as I said, the ecosystem for us divided in terms of decision makers, modelers, and boundary organizations. And within that, the sub-layers was that something which is more interpersonal or individual, something to do which is more of organizational inter-organization, and something which is more of environmental in nature. So when we start about interpersonal within decision-making space, the capacity of modelers become very, very important to influence the uptake of model evidence. And when we talk about in kind of inter-organizational space, the strategic position of organization was very, very important to create engagement between modelers and senior decision makers. So that facilitated the uptake of model evidence and its use in policy making. And at an environmental level, The availability of data was very, very important. And these are all reported by decision makers in terms of what kind of things affect use of modeled evidence in decision making. According to modelers, the capacity to produce relevance amongst the community has got very, very important factor. And the ability to communicate and logical presentation of models is a key driver as far as uptake of evidence is concerned. And a modeler's perspective, the way the technical working groups are organized, the task force are organized, the advisors of Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, in particular health program, also affects the way the evidence is taken up. And mostly one of the biggest inter-organizational aspect that was facilitated was that the need of policymakers in terms of evidence and the time taken for creating that modeled evidence at times creates a constraint and it affects the uptake of evidence. And at times, if it is based on the need, it happens faster. If it is not, then at times even the good evidence is not taken up. And an environmental factor, according to modelers, the availability to fund, continuous availability of funds to develop models is a crucial factor. At boundary organization, the way individuals in the organization has capacity to kind of wove the ecosystem is very, very important, along with the presence of experienced modelers and academic institution in this network, very, very important to drive uptake of modeled evidence in decision making. And that also affects their ability for strategic engagement between modelers and decision maker, and create, and if that organization is already in space of organizational culture where this thing is used, it kind of facilitates the uptake of evidence. There also, at an ecosystem level or environmental factor level, the availability of data, specifically the population, is very, very important for them, which facilitates uptake of modeled evidence. Next slide, please. We also wanted to understand what are the structures that enables exchange between modelers and decision makers. And there were 4 main structures through which I think so the evidence generated gets communicated. Government advisory group, which I think so allows visibility and available evidence directly to decision makers. But obviously the reach to government becomes a challenge at times. The consortium approach, where the consortium shares evidence to decision maker, like in India, SARS, COVID-2 Genomic Sequencing Consortium, or Nigeria COVID-19 Research Consortium. I think that facilitates at times the uptake of evidence because it's collective effort. But obviously, there are conflict of interest, and many of these consortium may not have a direct access to policymakers. So again, it has got pros and cons in the way the knowledge translation happens. There are evidence in which the training session like Cochrane and Campbell collaboration or Center for Global Development Decision Support Group in India they conduct training sessions, and those training sessions also become platform for exchange or creation of model and sharing knowledge through modeled decision making. But it requires organization and convening capacity, which at times in larger ecospace is something that becomes a big area that needs to be strengthened. And the last is the government formed research partnerships, where there are the government established partnership forums like Ministry of Health commissioned report for COVID modeling in Kenya, which Emily kind of mentioned earlier. I think so that strengthens the way the model evidence is used for decision making, and the strengths are collaboration and clear expectation. But again, government may favor partners and they would like to work with certain kind of known partners, and that creates a challenge in the way the expertise gets tabled and the model gets evolved. Next slide, please. And based on this work, we had recommendations evolved for funders, modelers, as well as organization. And at a funder level, it's very important that no matter funder supports study in which country, it's very important for funders to motivate the use of local or regional data in creating model, because at a decision maker level, once the data is kind of exported from other country, there are a lot of questions raised on. they need to invest in supporting long-term and sustainable capacity building, which includes, and this resource needs to include for staff timing and the deliverables related to ensuring model creation which are relevant to policymakers, and building capacity to communicate to policymakers. And when funders fund a creation of model, it is very important that government is involved in this process right from the word go, because they are the final consumers of this modeled evidence. So it's very important for them to involve or engage government as far as possible, and develop process and outcome indicators for monitoring and tracking of evidence translation in monitoring grants. So it's very important. So they need to be policy centric, which helps in kind of uptake of evidence. And during health crisis like COVID-19, when there are shocks happening, establish committee for outside modelers providing technical assistance coordinated to support the government. So if, let's say, in India, there were a lot of modelers who came up and supported government, and I think a lot of things were facilitated by donors. And we would urge that funders keep on doing this as the field evolves. Next slide, please. For policymakers and decision makers, I think so. They need to facilitate access to data. I think that's the biggest challenge when the modelers face. And once the evidence is generated, they need to create or establish a repository of research and modeling outputs, which could be used for cross-learning amongst modelers and amongst policymakers. They also need to establish formal platforms where decision makers can regularly interact with modelers, because at the moment it's need-based, but there is no continuous structural approach to that, and we need to move towards a structural approach. There is a need to take the lead to ensure that modelers work together. So instead of supporting a group of modelers, the preferential treatment to certain modelers, that entire ecosystem building is very important as far as sustainability is concerned. And government itself needs to develop capacity both to understand and interpret models within its ecosystem of decision makers, and establish procedures and sufficient time allowed for review, consideration, and evidence of evidence, including model evidence. And this is a larger health system research ecosystem-based thing, which also affects the modeling community. And when modeling is created, obviously when you create a model, there is a causality for each and everything, and we need time to reflect on the causalities, and the ecosystem might change very fast, like in situation like COVID. So there is enough time to pause and reflect as far as things are concerned. Next slide, please. For modelers, please use local and regional data, which enhances uptake of evidence generated. Build long-term formal and informal relationship with decision maker, because that also facilitates uptake of evidence. Whenever there is a publication opportunity, please publish in open access journals. It has got wider circulation. Modelers learn, even decision makers learn through peer-reviewed journals. Support government to build its capacity. I think so that's the onus lies on the community to build capacity of decision makers in interpreting and understanding models. So instead of working in kind of silos, I think so they also need to put an effort. Modeling community need to put an effort in working with policymakers and get themselves trained in communication. And communication needs to be part of the budget, because most of the researchers don't put communication as part of the budget. So we need to do that. And like for decision makers, we need time. Modelers needs to invest time and reflect on what's doing, and build a plan for evaluative learning to better understanding which engagement practices work or which does not work. Next slide, please. And for organizations which is interact with modelers and decision makers, I think so they need to invest in building a kind of ecosystems, building a kind of sustainable communication protocols, where I think so this exchanges are possible, and they can help in facilitating creating designs, writing and editing and formatting, which supports modelers to kind of take up their evidence to decision maker. And wherever appropriate, include evidence from model building research in the pool of evidence used to engage decision makers. And I think so that's a way of creating interest or helping decision makers to understand what can work or what innovative insights a model evidence can bring onto table. So these are some findings from all the partners that we are presenting, and thank you very much indeed. Apurva, back to you.
Thank you, Maulik, for setting the stage for our panel discussion. I'd like to take a moment to introduce our three panelists. If we can please go to the panelist slide. Dr. Ali Sie is director of Nuna Health Research Center in Burkina Faso, one of our research partners for this project. He obtained his medical degree at Ouagadougou University and completed his PhD training in clinical epidemiology at Heidelberg University in Germany. He started his career at Banfaraz Regional Hospital as a clinician until he transferred as a research fellow to develop the clinical research at Nuna Health Research Center. Dr. Sie has been instrumental for the implementation of a sustainable clinical setting in Nuna Hospital for clinical research. His main research areas include epidemiology and clinical trials of infectious disease. He is also interested in conducting scientific investigation of health conditions and health systems research. Dr. Obinna Onwujekwe serves as coordinator of the Health Policy Research Group in Nigeria, also one of our research partners for this project. He obtained his medical degree at the University of Nigeria and also holds a Master of Science in Health Economics. His expertise includes health technology assessment, health policy and systems research, economic evaluation, equity analysis, healthcare financing, and public health economics. Dr. Onwujekwe also serves as professor of health and policy and pharmacoeconomics and pharmacoepidemiology at the University of Nigeria, director of research at the University of Nigeria, and editor of the African Journal of Health Economics. He is a leading health financing expert and chairs several committees, including the Senate Research Committee and the Committee on Enhancing Global Visibility at the University of Nigeria. Finally, I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Jackie Oliwa, our guest speaker from Kemri Wellcome Trust based in Kenya. Dr. Oliwa leads research for a partner project also funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, looking into modeling for decision-making surrounding COVID. She is a pediatrician, clinical epidemiologist, lecturer, and a doctorate research fellow with a research focus in health systems and implementation science. Her current project is focused on understanding the complex epidemiology of tuberculosis in children and optimizing use of guidelines and TB diagnostic tests to improve case detection of TB in children. She has collaborated with the Kenyan Ministry of Health and government hospitals in various quality improvement projects, clinical trials, and systematic reviews, all of which have contributed to building evidence-based care and policies for sick children in Kenya. Dr. Oliwa is passionate about capacity building and use of evidence to improve quality of care in children. I would now like to pass it back to Maulik to moderate our discussion and Q&A session. And please feel free to ask your questions for our speakers in the Q&A box below at any time. Over to you, Maulik.
Thank you very much, Apurva, indeed. And I also took a pleasure in a point in kind of inviting Dr. Ali, Dr. Obinna, and Dr. Jackie for this panel discussion. Before I go on to these colleagues, we would like to go through a kind of a poll, which primarily looks at how developed is modeling to decision-making ecosystem in your country. So once we get that poll results, I'll go back to Dr. Ali, Dr. Obinna, and Jackie with our following question. So we have got 2 minutes to answer the question, or 80% response rates for this. And post that, I'll reach out to our colleagues on the panel. Thank you. I think so. We can end the poll if it is okay. So I think so. In the response to how develop this modeling to decision-making ecosystem, we have got 53% of responses that there is a growing interest in use of modeling in decision-making space, but we still have limited capacity. Followed by, I think, the response of 18% each in modeled evidence is not or rarely being used, and modeling evidence is regularly used in disease or specific health fields, and there are no responses to something else. So this is a good segue thank you. This is a good segue to pose the first question to panelist Dr. Elisei. And based on your experience in Burkina Faso, what do you think is the biggest kind of a need or experience from the study as far as need that we need to build on in using modeled evidence in decision making? Dr. Ali?
Yes, thank you very much.
So repeat the question. So according from the study, what do you think is the biggest need at a country level to enhance use of modeled evidence in decision making? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to sit in this panel. As I'm the only francophone in this panel, I would like to speak in French for the French speakers as well to pick some. Donc, merci beaucoup. Je voudrais dire le besoin important pour que les preuves modélisées soient utilisées dans nos pays, c'est d'abord de disposer des preuves modélisées qui soient pertinentes pour le système de santé. Et pour que ces preuves modélisées soient pertinentes pour le système de santé, il faut que ces preuves aient été élaborées en collaboration avec les décideurs. Dans notre cadre au niveau du Burkina Faso, ce que nous avons observé, c'est que d'abord, la production des preuves modélisées se trouve à un état embryonnaire. Ça, c'est le premier point. Le deuxième point, c'est que les capacités pour produire ces preuves modélisées sont limitées. Ça, c'est le deuxième point. Et le troisième point, c'est qu'il y a en fait une déconnexion entre ceux qui produisent les preuves modélisées et ceux qui doivent les utiliser. Et ceux qui utilisent ont des capacités limitées et ceux qui doivent les utiliser ont également des capacités limitées pour non seulement les comprendre et les utiliser. Donc, du coup, on a deux blocs qui sont un peu parallèles et qui travaillent chacun dans sa direction, et où le pont n'est pas clairement établi pour qu'on puisse aller vers l'utilisation des preuves modélisées. Pour ne pas être très long, je vais m'arrêter ici par rapport à cette réponse. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ali. And the capacity is the right area that you are focused upon. But if I may go to Dr. Obina from the Health Policy Research Group at Nigeria, can you share something more about Nigeria from what we have heard about the global finding? Are there specific areas at a country level that you would think that needs to be focused to enhance developing models and use of models in decision making?
Yes, so thanks a lot for the question. So in Nigeria, I think what we discovered was the capacity to understand and use model evidence. So part of the what we are thinking of, what part of the findings and recommendation was that we need to create more local capacity to produce modeled evidence, but also capacity on the part of decision makers to actually use modeled evidence for policy making and all that. But that also brought into for the necessity to have, knowledge brokers, like we said, who can actually take the modeled evidence from the modelers and help to translate the evidence and to broker this evidence to the decision makers for proper decision making. So that's what we discovered. I mean, it happened a lot during the COVID. These are all these kind of models that helps to get modeled evidence into policy and practice, because COVID actually created the environment, where modeled evidence was now looked for and used in Nigeria. But we still discover that there are still gaps that need to be filled in capacity in both the modelers and the decision makers to be able to use modeled evidence. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Obina. I think so. You also resonated with what Dr. A said in terms of the need of building capacity. May I go to Dr. Jackie? And I think so. Kenya used modeled evidence in various spaces: tuberculosis, malaria, NTDs, rabies, influenza, COVID-19. And if I look at all the countries that they studied, it's the country which has used most evidence, modeled evidence in decision making. So can you share something about Nigeria and your work across sub-Saharan Africa on how this ecosystem is building up, or how it's getting built up on use of modeled evidence in decision making?
So our project was looking at various countries in low and middle income countries, so from Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, and trying to understand the ecosystem like you describe it, and to what extent modeling is being used for decision making. And Kenya, as you say, stood apart because quite a bit was happening, but in some settings, as you know, not much was going on. So we've established there's a whole spectrum from where some countries just have one or two modelers and not much in the way of deep exchange going on with policymakers, to the very much extreme end where there are already centers of excellence established, and networks already established, and policy modeling decision making going on in quite an extent. So in these low and middle income countries, there's quite a diversity, and we also were able to establish what knowledge exchange mechanisms are preferred or are recommended by both policymakers and researchers. And the thing that stood out most is people prefer face-to-face debriefing sessions. And our work was focused on COVID-19 modeling. And you can imagine in a pandemic, now this becomes pretty challenging because of the restrictions meeting face-to-face, and yet decisions were supposed to be made. So these are some of the things that we've been able to unearth, alongside what others have mentioned about lack of capacity. That also came out strongly. And then leveraging existing relationships is what helped at least Kenya in our setting, and several other countries like South Africa. They were able to build on what existed before to support.
Hello? Hello, Dr. Jackie? I think so. We have lost Dr. Jackie. Till the time she comes back, I think so. We would also like to hear from the group of colleagues who have joined us online. According so, we would like to go to another poll question, which talks about. So can we relay the second poll question, please? And the poll question we would like to hear from you, which is the biggest challenge in ensuring the impact of modeling on decision making in your country? Jackie, we lost you, so we have started this poll question.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No worries. So same, we have got 2 minutes, and we go back to Jackie after that. Which is the biggest challenge in ensuring the impact of modeling on decision-making in your country? Whether it's capacity to produce and use models, lack of strategic engagement, time constraints, availability of data, constraints in communicating. What according to you is the biggest challenge? 2 minutes. Can we have the response, please? Thank you. So the response are interesting, more interesting than the previous one. And I think so the response are scattered this time. The capacity to produce and use of policy relevant research, I think so again, top scores, and the capacity word has been used quite oftenly by all the three panelists. Lack of strategic engagement, and it will be important to understand what does it mean at a country level strategic engagement. Time constraints got 14% response, availability of data. Interestingly, has got a same response as the lack of strategic engagement, and the kinds constraints got same response as constraints in communication. Very interesting findings. Thank you, please. So if I go back to Jackie, Jackie was sharing about the capacity and need of something. So can you elaborate on that because we lost you there?
Apologies, internet connection in low and middle income countries.
Okay.
So I was explaining that across the spectrum of the countries, some in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, there was a diversity. Some countries just have a few modelers without strong linkages to policymakers. Some have some linkages with policymakers, and some were even having policy modeling going on, all the way to established centers of excellence, which is where we all aspire to get to. And so we try and see what knowledge exchange mechanisms people preferred or were being used, and face-to-face debriefing sessions, meetings between the policy decision makers and the modelers came out strongly. And you can see this became a challenge during the pandemic because of the various restrictions and lockdowns, where now it became impossible to meet face to face. So people had to now use platforms like we are doing now for Zoom, with varying success across the board, but other means like printed policy briefs and brochures and evidence summaries still went on. And I think people have talked about capacity building. That also came out quite strongly in our work. So capacity for researchers to communicate their findings, so that whole science communication, and then for policymakers to use evidence for decision making. But then something else that came out that really needed to be there was building working relationships. So countries that were successful to continue working during the pandemic tended to leverage on existing prior working relationships, because it's really hard to build that trust in an emergency setting. So this needs to have been in existence before, and that's what was leveraged on in the countries that were emerging as successful, where working relationships are there. So there's strong need for transparency and trust between researchers and policymakers, and this needs to be long-standing so that now when you have an emergency, you're able to leverage on this. So I think that's what I can comment on for now. Over to you, Maulik.
Thanks, Jackie. So, Ellie and Obina, you both did mention about the need of capacity building, and Jackie also seconded that. So, Ellie, if I may come back to you, whose responsibility at the country level is to build capacity in creating models or building capacity of policymakers? Whose responsibility is it? Dr. Ellie?
OK. Merci beaucoup pour cette question de renforcement des capacités. Alors, si nous parlons de renforcement des capacités, nous le disons à deux niveaux. Et il y a le premier niveau qui est en fait de renforcer les capacités de ceux qui font la modélisation. Le deuxième niveau, c'est renforcer la capacité de ceux qui doivent utiliser les modèles. Alors, je dirais sans en tout cas hésiter que renforcer la capacité de ceux qui doivent produire les capacités incombe directement aux décideurs politiques. Parce qu'il faut déjà un engagement stratégique. Un engagement stratégique implique qu'on met en place une culture d'utilisation des évidences. Je ne parle pas d'abord des évidences modélisées, des évidences de recherche, les résultats de recherche. Il faut déjà que ça, la culture d'utiliser ces évidences-là, soit là. Et l'étape supérieure, c'est la culture d'utiliser les évidences modélisées. Et tout cela, s'il y a un engagement stratégique, le renforcement des capacités est pris en compte, le financement est pris en compte, le mécanisme de discussion entre ceux qui doivent produire les évidences modélisées et les décideurs sont mis en place et tout ça est pris en compte au niveau des décideurs. Mais maintenant, pour la formation et le renforcement des capacités des décideurs, je pense que c'est là où les organismes intermédiaires, la coopération pour les parties prenantes qui accompagnent le système démocratique interviennent. Il faut que ces décideurs, qu'on les aide à renforcer cette culture de l'utilisation de soient formés. Il faut qu'ils soient formés à comprendre et à les utiliser. Mais déjà, il faut qu'eux, ils aient cet engagement stratégique. Alors, on peut me dire tout simplement que oui, mais vous connaissez un peu le turnover, le changement au niveau des décideurs. Oui, c'est vrai. Mais vous savez qu'au niveau de l'administration publique, il y a la tête qui change fréquemment, mais il y a une base de techniciens qui reste. Une base de techniciens qui reste. Et je pense que le renforcement des capacités doit aller directement à cette base-là, bien sûr, avec les décideurs. De sorte que s'il y a un changement, il y a toujours cette mémoire institutionnelle préservée et toujours cette préoccupation. Merci.
Thank you, Dr. Ellie. So, Dr. Obina, the question also remains, would your experience from your country would be similar to what Dr. Ellie mentioned, or would there be someone else responsible to build capacity, both in terms of modelers' capacity or understanding of modeled evidence? Would you think that there would be someone who is positioned to take in that responsibility at a country level, Dr. Obina?
Yeah, so I would not think it's someone. I think it's more of an institutional capacity building, not a person. So I think it's something that we made priorities. For instance, by national health research committees, that this capacity is needed to generate evidence for decision making. is something that the apart from national health research committees, some ministries of health and then academies, science academies, these are areas we expect them to take it up. So, and then because it's something that needs to be embedded within the system, it's not an ad hoc thing. So, so we need a lot of institutional partners coming out to take the challenge of building this capacity, developing some curriculum that can, be taught in universities, in relevant departments, whether it's public health or statistics or economics, wherever is relevant. But I think it needs a more sectoral approach. But I think it's something, like I said, science academies and national health research committees should be able to drive. But of course, in everything, you always need policy champions. So if we can also identify 2 or 3 policy champions in the country that will make sure that these institutions actually come up and start doing something, that's really important. But the question is, who are the policy champions? Maybe that's what you're asking. And I think a lot of us that have been part of this project, we should be the policy champions, together with some important boundary partners that we found in this study, who are really interested. I think we need to engage with them more and develop an implementation plan for capacity building of not just the researchers, but also the policymakers in the production and use of modeled evidence. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robina. Fantastic insight. Let me go back to Jackie, because Jackie, you did mention about working in kind of Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia on this space. So, and we heard from Eddie and Obina that there are multiple players who needs to come together in building capacity, right? But if I want to create a roadmap, Dr. Obina did mention that the National Health Research Center can take a stewardship of that. But what does your experience from multi-country learning say that how we can make this roadmap in those countries where it's at the very nascent stage? What could be the approach taken up? Dr. Jackie.
Thanks, Maulik. And I think what you're doing is preempting part of what we are trying to think of or to continue developing as part of our study. And what we're doing is trying to map the key stakeholders in actually the countries where we are working in. And we think, just like Dr. Obina mentioned, that we'd have to start from the people who are doing the modeling themselves, so having the research organizations, and then because we're talking about modeling for health, then Ministry of Health are going to be key players. And I think donors also have a role, because I think when you talk to most of these people, they'll be like, if there's no budget for it, then very little will get done. But even as donors and other non-state actors come in, I think for sustainability, the government, now wider beyond the Ministry of Health, now national governments need to have this as a priority, where evidence is used for policy decision making, not only for health, but across the board. And so now budgets need to be put in place to establish this. So across the board, if we were thinking about in terms of broad roadmaps, first,
I think so. We lost Dr. J.K. once again. So let's again take an opportunity to launch a poll, and which is linked to the capacity building thing itself. If we may launch the poll, and the poll question is as follows: what is the most important step to build modeling capacity in the country? What is the most important step to build modeling capacity in the country? We have heard some answers from panelists, but your response would be very, very helpful. Thank you. Jackie, I think so. When we come to you, we lose you. So we have launched poll question. We'll come back to you again.
It was my second backup. Now I'm on my third backup. Sorry, guys.
So we have poll responses, which again is scattered, but obviously the scattered nature of the response demonstrates that there are multiple approaches required to build a modeling capacity, and it starts from sponsored PhD. We have got 4 responses out of 37. Established communities of practice 27%, established center of excellence 16%, put in place secondment of fellowship around 22%. So I think so. From this poll results, I would interpret is that multi-pronged strategy would be required to build a modeling capacity at a country level. So thank you very much. So Jackie, coming back to you, you were trying to complete something.
Yeah, and I think the poll has preempted about the different approaches. I think I got cut off as I was trying to explain about trying to build the relationships first of all, and then once the relationships are there, build the capacity for the researchers to do policy modeling, and then for the decision makers to do evidence-based policy decision making, and then having them work together to have co-creation so that they are able to communicate constantly and build these tasks and relationships. And then eventually now we get, so that's short term. And then if we're thinking about sustainability and long term is now embedding this into postgraduate, undergraduate training. And that's where now we have where the countries develop culture of using research consistently across the board. Now, funding, we'd need to get donors on board, but then again, when we're talking about sustainability, we think this is something that should also be part of national government's responsibility. So having a budget for that, so that across the board, not just for health, whether it's defense, land, etc., policy decisions are always made supported by evidence. So that culture needs to be developed over time. And once it's there, then, you know, we'll have funding coming directly from the government with support of non-state actors where relevant. Yeah.
So this question is open to Jackie, you, Obina, Eddie as well. And Obina has answered. And so response from Jackie and Eddie would be important. Who steers that? Because someone still needs to take ownership of doing that, right? Rolling out PhDs or coordinating donor efforts. One of the criticism that we get in our finding also there, multiple donors having differential priorities which might not be aligned to the need of the country. So who takes responsibility of binding them together? Who should be taking that responsibility? Dr. Ellie, any feedback on that? And Jackie, I'll come to you. Dr. Ellie?
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
What was the question? Can you repeat for me? Sorry.
So who needs to take the owner? Who becomes the steward in doing all this activity? We need a focal organization or institution, as Dr. Obina said. So who, according to you, should be a government should take a responsibility, or a parasocial organization should be taking a responsibility, or a donor should be taking, who should be taking responsibility of doing all this and bringing things together?
Non, merci beaucoup pour la question. Non, évidemment, il faut que ce soit une appropriation interne, il faut que ce soit national. Il faut que ce soit le gouvernement qui prend cette responsabilité. Parce que c'est sa responsabilité de prendre soin de la santé de la population et de mettre tout en place pour pouvoir les aider à prendre les décisions les meilleures pour pouvoir résoudre les questions de santé. Maintenant, les autres partenaires qui tournent autour doivent accompagner ce que sera mis en place de façon endogène. Ils viennent pour accompagner, mais pas pour remplacer. Et le gouvernement doit en fait mettre en place une stratégie, que ce soit les stratégies de renforcement de compétences, les stratégies de communication, les mécanismes d'interaction entre ceux qui développent les évidences, ceux qui utilisent les évidences. Parce que tant qu'il n'y aurait pas quelque chose de cohérent dans ce sens-là, et ça ne portera pas fruit. Et pour la pérennisation, il faut que vraiment ce soit une initiative endogène de coordination. Les donneurs, les partenaires bilatéraux peuvent accompagner le mécanisme, mais accompagner la vision de gouvernement. Et je pense que ça doit être vraiment en interne que la stratégie doit être affinée, la vision doit être affinée pour qu'on puisse aboutir vraiment à une utilisation véritable. Il faut cette culture d'utilisation des évidences. Que ce soit des évidences simples de recherche ou des évidences modélisées, il faut cette culture. Une fois que la culture est là, les jalons sont posés, les autres partenaires viendront et accompagneront pour que ça puisse émerger et aider également à ce que ça puisse tenir la route et donner des résultats probants. Donc, voilà un peu ce que je peux dire par rapport à ça. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Otele. So, Dr. Jackie, again, we have two responses. Dr. Jackie, we have got two responses which does mention about the role of government as steward in kind of bringing this modern community together. Firstly, from my experience, does it kind of echo that one thing, and how does it kind of address the challenge that I said it takes a lot of time and there are preferences that government may have, which might not be good in kind of developing ecosystem as a whole. So based on your multi-country experience, how would you respond to it? Dr. Jackie?
I think the government still have a central role in if we're going to have ownership and sustainability. They need to be on board and engaged, because when you're doing your stakeholder mapping, you have to think who has the most power and the most influence. And I think the government does, because you can go to a lot of work, but if the government doesn't have ownership, then for sustainability, that won't be there. But that being said, they have to be supported to understand the importance of modeling and evidence and what have you. And I think that's where Dr. Bino mentioned champions. And most of these champions would come from the boundary organizations or from modelers themselves. So being there and trying to communicate the importance of the work they do until now to create demand, as it were. And I think something that we found unique in one of the countries, I think that was Brazil, where there was actually political pressure from the general public. They started to demand that the government should use evidence for some of these COVID decisions, because they were like, if we're going on lockdown or some of these decisions being made, where is the evidence to show that this is what is needed? So I think also as scientists being able to connect to the lay public so that they start to support us in creating demand for this, I thought that was a unique perspective from one of the countries. So government has a central role, but for them to take up that role, they need to understand the importance. How do they understand the importance? By us communicating this and also getting support from the lay public to create that kind of demand. Over.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jackie. Before we move forward, let me get another poll question running through, and which is again, here we are talking about there is some level of ecosystem going on. But how can researchers in a country with limited modeling experience establish a place for modeling in their country? So disease-specific opportunities we have talked about, and there are opportunities, but what about health systems researcher? What about a health economist working out? What about financing expert working out? What about pharmaceutical economist working out? How can researchers in a country with limited modeling experience establish a place in modeling in the country? Thank you. 2 minutes. The responses, we have got a leader out here. Facilitate forums, workshop, and working group and community of practice, if I read it correctly. Community of practice of model evidence can be discussed. That could be a way of establishing place, and then engaging with government to develop concept of model, and will be another approach to which a researcher can establish himself as far as modeling in their country is concerned. Thank you very much indeed. So if I may go further, I think so we are running short of time. So Dr. Ellie, any closing remarks before we go to the Q&A? There are a couple of questions in session. So any particular remark you want to make before I go to Q&A? Dr. Ellie, Dr. Obina, Dr. Jackie, or should I go to Q&A?
Non, je voulais peut-être prendre cette opportunité pour dire un mot avant que vous partiez aux questions-réponses. Il faut un point d'entrée. C'est vrai que les chercheurs, ils sont en nombre limité, ceux qui travaillent sur les preuves modélisées. Et il y a des problèmes de renforcement des capacités, comme nous l'avons dit, mais il faut qu'il y ait un point de connexion entre ceux qui travaillent sur les preuves modélisées et les décideurs qui utilisent les preuves modélisées. Et si ce point d'ancrage n'existe pas, s'il n'y a pas de stratégie cohérente au niveau du pays pour pouvoir utiliser ces preuves modélisées, ça va être difficile que ça puisse prendre de l'essor. Parce qu'il faut déjà une appropriation au niveau local, au niveau des gouvernements locaux, pour en faire des preuves modélisées, en tout cas une priorité en matière de prise de décision. Ce que nous avons observé lors de la COVID, c'est vrai que la COVID-19 a été une opportunité qui a donné un coup de pouce à l'utilisation des preuves modélisées, mais ceux qui ont fait développer des modèles, en tout cas au niveau du Burkina, ont fait un travail personnel de réflexion qui a suscité un intérêt de la part des décideurs, mais il n'y a pas eu de concertation au début. Et du coup, les gens ont travaillé sans vraiment avoir des données réelles sur le terrain. Ils ont utilisé ce qu'ils avaient et bien sûr, ils ont développé quelque chose qui techniquement était cohérent, mais qui, dans la réalité, posait quelques difficultés. Donc, il faut que ces deux groupes soient ensemble et qu'il y ait en tout cas quelqu'un qui serve également de pont pour les unir ensemble, pour que ce qui est développé puisse être compris et utilisé, et qu'il y ait quelqu'un au milieu et qui va catalyser cette utilisation. Donc, voilà un peu ce que je voulais ajouter avant qu'on continue. Merci.
Thank you, Dr. Eli. Dr. Obina, any closing observations before we go to a Q&A, please?
Yeah, I think my closing remark is that, we need to emphasize to policymakers, decision makers, that any good evidence is better than no evidence for decision making. And then where evidence is not coming from maybe data collection, primary data collection, which they're used to, that the next best option is modeled evidence. And it also gives a basis for taking decisions, because taking decision without evidence, leads to failure. So, like I said, who would drive this process within the countries, where I see academics of science working closely with relevant departments in the ministries of health, to make sure to build this area of using modeled evidence for decision making. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Obina. Dr. Jackie?
So I think a lot has been said, but for me, I think what I can add on is that the world is now a global village. And for countries that have little to no capacity, I think we need to emphasize the room for collaboration, where regional centers of excellence can be established, where data sharing can be done, where building modelings for the region can be done, and working collaboratively, working together with those that have capacity, so that this becomes, that's how we be your brother's keeper. Let's help each other along the way. Because as we've seen in the example of the pandemic, where one country is affected and then the whole world gets affected. So even for solutions, we need to find opportunities for collaboration. That's it for me. Over.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jackie. So we have a couple of questions in QA box. So I'll start. There is one observation from Sarah Martin, and she works at ODF Fellow in Nigeria Ministry of Health as an economic advisor. And she commented that there is a value of placing technical training assistants with modeling experience inside government agency to really build capacity day to day. And I think it would be even better for making available fellowship scholarships for government staff working in critical department. This can be added to also with support of application to international national conference. So I think a lot of things that colleagues have been saying, that building capacity can have multiple approaches. And so Sarah Martin has observation of all those approaches can be used, at least in Nigeria Ministry of Health and NPHCDA, to build capacity and modeling. So there are a lot of India-specific questions, which I'll come to that. But there is a specific question from Ganyu Salau. And the question is, what policy levers can we use to promote greater reliance on applied research outcomes, modeled evidence for decision-making in lower and middle income countries? So what are the evidence? So I think so, Obina, you want to take this question, or Dr. Jackie, you want to take this question? Because I think so that relates to what Dr. Obina said recently. So what policy levers can we use to promote or encourage greater reliance on outcomes or decision modeled evidence for decision making?
Well, I think the lever is that, sometimes policymakers need data, information very quickly. So that becomes a lever that, if you need something very quickly, modeled evidence can provide you that sort of evidence that's needed. But it's to engage, how do we engage with those policymakers so that they'll get the evidence and they know where to go to the evidence. But I think that's the lever, that this modeled evidence provides very rapid evidence that is needed. We saw it during the response to COVID-19 and other pandemics. So I think for me, that will be an important lever. But I think for also the policymakers to be receptive to evidence and to use the evidence. I think so within ministries of health, I think there's a movement, well, in some countries in Nigeria, to have these, you know, a kind of a policy liaison division within the ministry that will harness this kind of evidence and feed the evidence to the relevant departments within the ministry that will need them. So I think if this framework is created within the Ministry of Health, you know, where the evidence is you know, is collated and sent to where they are needed within the ministry or even outside the ministry, I think that will be an important, if I put lever for it, for getting modeled evidence to be useful everyday decision making. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm just using word window of opportunity. When there are window of opportunity, you see them. So Dr. Jackie, there is an interesting question. I think so your multi-country experience might be able to answer this. What kind of models are acceptable to policymakers in study sites? Are there instances where system dynamic modeling are used for improving health services delivery in these sites where research was carried out? So based on your multi-country experience, do policymakers prefer a type of model?
A type of model? We didn't explore that question specifically about whether they prefer a type of model. What we're asking is how they want the evidence presented. And I think modeling, if you're not a modeler yourself or not familiar with working modeling, it's very strange to try and interpret. So you can imagine a policymaker being asked what type of modeling, like, do they want infectious disease modeling broken down into, so for us, it was like, how do they want that data sort of broken down for them? So what came out strongly is they don't even want to actually read those reports. They want face-to-face debriefing meetings by the experts breaking down. So what do these numbers mean? And the bottom line is, so, like, how much is it going to cost? How long will it take? Like that. So they want very simple messages for them for decision making. So I wouldn't even go to the level of what type of model. There'd be very few decision makers who would be in that space unless they have that specific training. They want the sort of information broken down even more into, the bigger picture, like what does that mean for my country, for my province, Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. That's very interesting because when we were working in India, I think so there was a group who were advanced level. They talk about stochastic modeling and kind of stuff and how they could be used. But at the policymakers level, you rightly pointed out, for them, they were not much concerned about the models, but the outcome of the models, whether it can help in making a policy decision. That was more important. And just understanding the nuances on the deviation of outcomes based on the model was something that they were more interested on. So I just take a last question from a colleague who has asked India specific. So India, Preetham, I think so India being the private sector or a mixed market, I think so you rightly pointed out it's difficult to access information, public versus private. And I think so the efforts, I think so what the health system efforts at a national level are towards harnessing data from both the sectors and the national, the tax supported health insurance scheme is moving towards that in getting information from both the sectors, which can be used in any kind of decision making from both the sectors. Preetham, there are a lot of other questions which I think so you can reach out to the study team based in India, which will be happy to answer your questions further. And since we are running short of time, what I would now like is to just thank Dr. Ellie, Dr. Obina, Dr. Jackie for giving your valuable time and insight to the work that has been done so far and the progressing of work. And we believe there will be important lessons for the countries who want to develop capacity of using modeled evidence in decision making, at various levels. So with that note of the thanks from my side, I'll hand it over to Apurva. Apurva, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Malik. And once again, thank you to our panelists for sharing your invaluable insight and feedback. Now I'd like to hand it to my colleague, Ms. Ababa Tadessa, Senior Program Director at Results for Development, for our closing remarks.
Great. Thank you, Apurva, and thank you, panelists, discussants, and participants. I think this has been a really rich discussion, and we are sort of grateful for this research to help us better understand how to make, policy and the outputs from disease models more relevant to decision makers. I think I'm going to start with a frame that says, just kind of as a key reflection from this discussion is that the governments in the low and middle income countries in which we did our studies want to use modeled evidence, right? There is increasing appetite for modeled evidence to inform emergency response and preparedness, to understand the effectiveness of interventions and strategies. Are there capacity constraints? Absolutely. And I would argue that the capacity constraints exist across all different contexts, across many different governments. But starting with this frame that says, here are governments that increasingly want to use modeled evidence, I think is a good starting point, rather than starting with all the capacity constraints and deficits that we ended with, right? Absolutely agree that there's those capacity constraints and deficits. Some of the key things that stood out to me, I think, in this discussion were this, nearly all of the panelists talk in the context of an ecosystem, right? And I think that's really important because it's helping us move away from just thinking about the evidence production side or just even thinking about the use side, but really thinking about all of the different actors, including those in the middle space that work as intermediaries or boundary organizations, knowledge brokers, whatever we call them. I think it's important to really think about all of those different actors and how they interrelate, right, to inform, to help us understand policy, to influence policy, and to really get sort of, data and evidence in the hands of decision makers. The other thing that really stood out to me from this kind of discussion is, I would say, I was really trying to come up with like the 3 R's or something, but I think I ended up with just relationships, right? It's important for the policymaker to have a relationship with the researchers, right? It's important to really think about, I think Jackie mentioned the co-production model, right? So that the policymakers are engaged from the outset in designing, in co-creating. It's important to have a relationship between government and civil society, right? So that the models that we are producing are responding to civil society questions and concerns. It's important for the boundary organizations, those in the middle, to understand how to navigate that space, to more effectively communicate research, to engage with policymakers, to bring their concerns to researchers, to help navigate contested issues. So I would say relationships, both formal and informal, are really key, right? And I think that's really important to think about, because you want policymakers to have a connection before, I think, as Malik said, before a crisis like COVID arises, right? And we've seen that responses have been greater where there has been an existing relationship. So I'll end with that note. I know we're at time, but I do want to encourage you to check out our resources and all of the products that have been developed from this research. Apurva is dropping, I think, the link in the chat. Thank you again to all of the panelists and to everyone who is here today. And we hope to continue this conversation. So please do engage with the resources on our site. Thanks again.